So let's problematize this a little bit, Jenny. Why is it important to be concrete? Like, what are you losing if you're not being concrete? What are you getting from doing this? Like, what is the problem that you are trying to solve for people here?
James, I think I'm going to have to think my way into the answer here. So, the biggest thing I think that's problematic about conversing with other people only at the level of your assumptions, your judgments, and your conclusions is that you are dominating the discussion from your worldview. And it's not necessarily how other people see it. And often, especially if you're the person in power, you're, again, influencing what is discussable by saying only your conclusions. And so, part of my passion around the value of, hey, what made you draw that conclusion is that it's fairer and better and more equal when we all can talk about what are the data, what are the actual phenomena, what are we actually seeing in the world that we are talking about. So, an example, like I was talking to a colleague recently, and she said, so and so is so rude and dismissive. And I said, huh, that sounds frustrating. But then I said, like, what did he say or do that made you think he was rude or dismissive? And she said, well, he interrupted me twice before I finished. And uh, knowing the colleague she was talking about, I said, I guess it's possible that he was being rude or dismissive, but from what I know about that guy, he's probably really excited about what you were talking about. And he was like jumping in to join the conversation. So it might be the opposite of dismissive. It might be he's trying to build on what you're doing, even if he did it in a way that annoyed the bleep out of you. So, what I like about being concrete is if I go back to her and I say, hey, I get that the impact on you was you felt dismissed, but we don't really know what his intention was, and we don't really know what he was doing. And so I just think it's so much fairer and better, and we'll make better decisions if we can include both what we actually saw and heard and perhaps the impact as well. But without what we actually saw and heard, we don't really know what's going on.
Was it me? There aren't that many men who work for our
No,
organization.
no, no. Welcome back to Curious Now from the Center for Medical Simulation. I'm Jenny Rudolph. Today's readiness goal is being concrete. And that means actually saying what you saw or heard, or it could be things that were missing, that weren't said or weren't heard. But instead of sharing your conclusions, your judgments, your inferences, you're going to try to peel those inferences away from what you actually saw or heard and state what you actually saw or heard. For the last 20 years, I've been working with clinicians and managers and leaders around the world, primarily in healthcare, who have the job of leading feedback conversations or being the beneficiary or participant in a feedback conversation. And almost to a person, and I'll just include myself in that too, in those feedback conversations, people often fall into the trap of sharing an inference that they've drawn about the other person or an inference about what's happened, such as, you, resident, didn't call me with the labs, and therefore you're not a committed resident because you said you were going to call me and you didn't call me. My inference is you're not committed. But I don't really know the data of why you didn't call me. And so, what I've found working with these clinicians over the last 20 years to dial up the quality of their and my feedback conversations is that putting out between the two humans, here's the observable things that happened, is a way to bridge thought worlds. So that concrete description of what somebody said or did or said or didn't say or didn't do is the thing that lets me get from my inferences over to their inferences. How I originally got into this was as a doctoral student. I started my research career working with my mentor, John Carroll, who was a professor at MIT Sloan School and an expert in something called naturalistic decision making, including in high hazard industries, which are industries like nuclear power, chemical processing, where if you make poor decisions or you have poor learning processes, really bad things can happen. And in one of the studies that I worked on with John, we looked at accidents and errors in about 30 different nuclear power plants. And what we were looking at is the original sense making process about why did the accident happen, and comparing that to the more rigorous root cause analysis that was ultimately done. And what we found was this weird paradox, which is the more certain people were they knew what had happened, usually the less right they were. And what we found was that often what people thought happened and what actually happened was rarely a matchup. And almost always there were these very small pieces of overlooked data, a pressure reading, a valve setting, an obscure rule somebody had followed that nobody knew they still followed, that radically changed the story of the accident. And this, along with my training as a PhD student, which forced me to say, hey, whenever I had a conclusion, what was the evidence? What was the data that led me to that conclusion? Really, really hurt my brain, but made me realize that concrete data, when we're communicating across different thought worlds, is incredibly important. One of the things that we can do to be more concrete when we talk is recognize that inference drawing process. So, the big picture of this was described beautifully by Daniel Kahneman in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, where he talks about how we automatically make a bunch of different kinds of decisions. And sometimes we more deliberatively make decisions. But when we're in automatic mode, we see stuff, we use what's called recognition primed decision making. Recognition primed decision making is a phenomenon identified by Gary Klein, who studied firefighters and other uh, decision makers who needed to figure out things quickly. And it happens, you see a pattern that you've seen in the world before, you run up what Chris Argyris calls the ladder of inference, and you decide what's happening. So, the other metaphor I'd like to introduce here, besides thinking fast and slow, is this idea of the ladder of inference. The ladder of inference includes this idea that as we walk around in the world, there's data out there, things that are objectively happening, cars beeping, music playing, people talking, things happening in our workplaces. And that buzzing, blooming cacophony of things is too much for us to process. And so we select certain parts of that observable data to pay attention to. And that's what we do at the bottom of the ladder of inference. We select some data. Then we usually name it. So, for example, let's say my colleague comes late to a meeting. I've already labeled it. Let me try that again. The meeting was starting at 10 a.m. My colleague walks in at 10:15. I label that late. So that's the second rung on the ladder of inference. I take the data, this person came in at 10:15, I label it late. And then I also might make an inference or draw a conclusion about my colleague. They don't take this meeting seriously, or they don't take this meeting as seriously as I do. And the data that led me to that, which is arriving 15 minutes after the start of the meeting, is what propelled me up the ladder of inference. And especially if I have strong feelings about their being late, I'm able to really zoom up the ladder with, the fuel of turbocharged indignation. So what we want to do when we're talking to the other humans is say, hey, wow, I got up here to the top of the ladder of inference. If I want to check out with them what's going on, I need to come back down. And so then I can say to my colleague, hey, I noticed the meeting started at 10, but you came in at 10:15. That made me think you don't actually take the meeting very seriously. And I feel kind of bad about that because I worked so hard to prepare it. And they might say to me, hey, Jenny, listen, my kid was sick, my car broke down, and I was so committed to coming to this meeting that I actually hopped on this bus, and I'm so happy I made it here by 10:15. So had I not shared that concrete data at the bottom of the ladder of inference, this story, this connection, this bridging of our two separate thought worlds might not even have happened. The workout of the week is going to end up with naming concrete data in some conversation you're having. Your workout of the week is to force yourself to name concrete data in a conversation you're having. How are you going to do this? Possibly in these 3 steps. So, first, catch your judgments. Notice when you label something. She was defensive is a label. Then ask yourself to step down the ladder of inference. What made me think she was defensive? What did I actually see or hear? What did she say that led me to the conclusion she's defensive? And then attempt to have the conversation with the other person or just practice in your own mind naming the data first. So I saw her cross her arms and I heard her say, I don't know, I don't know. Those were the data that made me conclude she was defensive. So I'd just like to circle back to why I think being concrete is so valuable. I find it serves as a coolant when I'm triggered. I run up the ladder of inference. I decide I know what's going on with the other human or what's going on in the meeting or why something's happening. I run forward with, some hostility or aggression or anger or indignation. And I found that if I can pause myself and force myself back down the ladder of inference, it cools down my emotions. It diminishes my certainty in the rightness of my perspective. And it forces me to have a little bit more humility about what is actually going on and hold my own views a little more lightly. Thank you so much for joining us with Curious Now. And I'd love to hear how your workout of the week goes.